What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and I know that, well, let's see, I probably wasn't going to stream this week. Well, wait a minute, hang on. Let me start this again. What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and this is episode 21 of season 3 of my live stream slash vlog thing. This is the episode for Friday, the 18th of June, 2021. I had to think about the month there for a second. Um, I know that I said last week I probably wasn't going to have a stream this week, and truthfully, well, I just answered my question. So the entire purpose of this stream really was to test out the new firmware that Canon had released for the 5D Mark IV. 5D Mark IV is my primary camera for streaming. It's hooked up using the EOS Webcam utility, and I have been running into problems where the 5D Mark IV is basically um, disconnecting from the EOS Webcam utility. And I'm not sure why. The video feed drops out and it just stops working. Now, I have not done an awful lot to troubleshoot this, truthfully. Um, it is not, I don't have it hooked up in what's arguably the best possible way. It's going through a USB hub and a monitor, through a USB hub and a second monitor, through to the computer's USB 3 port. They're all USB 3 hubs, but two hubs for a fairly high-ish bandwidth device is probably not the best thing to have it going through. Anyway, the big talking point for the firmware for the 5D Mark IV was improvements when using USB 3 cables. Now, I have no idea what that actually was supposed to mean. I don't know how you improve a camera's function when being used with a USB cable. USB cables don't have any electronics in them, at least not USB 3, Type B, etc. cables. It's just wires. And I'm really not sure how you can improve that with a firmware update to the camera. Anyway, so the thing that I wanted to test was to see whether or not the EOS utility dropped out, and well, it already dropped out once, so obviously it didn't completely fix the problem that I was having. Now, again, I'm not entirely sure what the source of the problem is. I think I probably should try hooking the camera up to my computer and directly and see if I still have the issue. Um, Part of the reason that I've been doing it the way I've doing it is where it is, where I have space for it, where I shoot for the videos, and the length of a USB cable that I would need to hook up to the computer. That said, since I am doing a stream, there's some stuff that I kind of wanted to talk about. Not in any great detail, so this probably won't be that long of a stream, but if I'm going to do it, I might as well talk about a couple of things. First thing that I wanted to talk about, I actually thought was rather amusing, which is there was just an article published on Canon Rumors based on an article published on Petapixel that Canon has confirmed that the sensor in the EOS R3 was designed by and will be manufactured or is being manufactured by them. I don't know where, apparently I'm often, not paying attention to what people talk about on discussion forums anymore. Apparently the people have been so convinced by, I'm not really sure, the media, the text camera media or something, that digital camera sensors are so hard and so expensive to design that Canon can't do their own sensor design work or something, and that for them to produce a competitive sensor, they would have to farm it out to Sony and buy something that Sony produced. Um, and I don't really get that, because for starters, sensors are not that complicated. Uh, they're not simple enough. I couldn't design one, but it's one photo site repeated over and over and over and over and over. Second of all, Canon has patents coming out, like tons of patents on sensor design, global shutters without having a loss in dynamic range. I mean, it's not like they don't know what they're doing, and I don't understand where this thing, this belief between, whether it's just because Nikon had to throw in the towel. And of course, this is, I guess, the other thing is most people, I think, that are looking at cameras or talking about cameras online forget the comparative sizes of Canon and Nikon. And yeah, Nikon was 50% of the digital camera market for a while. Roughly it was Canon and Nikon. And if all you ever thought about or all you ever cared about was whose market, or which company was what with respect to market share, then it would be very easy to come to the mistaken belief that Canon and Nikon, and I'm not talking about right now, I'm talking about in years past, Canon and Nikon were very similar sized companies. They each had about 50% of the camera market share, and there goes the video stream again. They each had about 50% of the camera industry market share, and so you could think, oh, well, they got to be about the same size. That's not the case at all. Canon is substantially bigger than Nikon. Now, Sony's bigger than Canon, and that's, just sort of the reality. Sony's also got their fingers into a lot of industries. Wow. This is almost worse than it was with the previous firmware that wasn't supposed to be improving the USB capability. Then again, it could just be tonight, which I've had that happen too. I've had days where this has worked perfectly with the camera, and I've had days where it just for whatever reason doesn't want to get along. Anyway, Sony's got their hands in market. It is bigger, yes, but they're also bigger because they have their hands in markets that Canon doesn't compete in. Canon doesn't make movies. Sony has a movie entertainment industry parts. Canon doesn't make game consoles. Sony does. I think maybe there's this thought, and I don't understand it, because quite honestly, it's... So this is what I get so frustrated about, because I remember reading an article a couple of years ago where somebody was talking about how because Sony has so much more money to spend, is so much bigger than Canon, they have so much more money to spend on R&D, Canon simply wouldn't be able to keep up Sony's sensors, and Sony is just going to run away with the market. Now the reality is if we stop and we look, Panasonic uses their own sensors. As far as I know, Sony does not make sensors for Panasonic cameras. Canon uses their own sensors. As far as I know, there's been no evidence anywhere at all suggesting that any of Canon's sensors are made by anybody but Canon, designed and manufactured. The only company besides Sony who has had a partnership with Sony is Nikon. And to be honest, I feel like that partnership with Sony was a bad move for Nikon. Yes, they did get some good cameras out of it. The D800, the D810, the D850, there was but they also helped Sony. Nikon, as I understand, the partnership wasn't Nikon's just buying Sony sensors. Nikon was helping Sony develop better sensors, or contributing technology, cross-pollinating, however you want to call it, technology with Sony, helping them improve their own sensors. And as a side effect of that, Nikon was designing sensors, incorporating both Nikon and Sony technologies, to be manufactured by Sony, among others. Nikon has also had their sensors manufactured by Dalsa. I know that for sure. which may now be Analog Devices or somebody. I don't remember who that there was a purchase, trade, sellout, whatever, something in there. So even in the case of Nikon, it's not even really a clean thing to say Nikon just bought Sony sensors, because as far as I understand, the sensors where there were like equivalency, Nikon had the sensors were different. And in a lot of cases, there were Nikon sensors that didn't have Sony equivalents, the 36 megapixel D800, D810, as far as, and the 45 megapixel D850, and Z7 and Z7 II are all basically, there's, as far as I've ever been able to see, there is no Sony comparable part. It's basically a Nikon design cross pollination of technology with Sony. Now, I can kind of understand what the thought process probably was on Nikon's part with getting into that. They're not as big as Canon. They don't have the manufacturing capacity or capability that Canon has. They aren't they're essentially a fabless semiconductor company. They aren't going to be, you know, they have to contract everything out to somebody else to manufacture. And more than likely, you know, they were looking at Sony, and Sony had technology that Nikon could use, and Nikon probably felt that it was a good, at the time, strategic move to partner with Sony for some sensor technology improvements or availability or whatever, some sensor technologies, and at the same time contribute some of their technology back, you know, shared both ways, essentially. Now, my argument would be, in hindsight, that was probably a bad move for Nikon. Nikon is suffering. Now they're suffering to a large or I won't say to a large extent, but they've got have had some serious problems that they're not recovered from and probably won't be for some time, with trying to, well, in some respects, trying to become more like Canon. So Canon has a strong medical equipment division, and Nikon was trying to get into doing medical equipment beyond just microscopes, because they do make microscopes, and that turned out to be a big problem for Nikon. Large and ended up having to write off a lot of money, lay off employees, so on and so forth. And but I can see where Nikon was probably thinking that this was a good move, again, to counter Canon. I don't think Nikon, when they were partnering with Sony, was thinking they're going to be competing with Sony in quite the way that, well, everybody's competing with Sony now. The problem now seems to be that Sony's eating Nikon's lunch. And there's a lot of people that want to say Sony's eating Canon's lunch, and I'm not at all convinced of that, because by and large, without needing to share technology with Sony, they have sensors that are of comparable dynamic range. Depending on who you are talking to, better color science. Some people like it, some people don't. It's, you know, could go either way, arguably. I would argue they have a vastly superior autofocus, on-sensor autofocus technology. Dual pixel AF is by far the best autofocus technology in the camera industry right now, and that didn't take Sony coming up and helping. Everything else is, as far as I'm concerned, a sort of kludgy workaround. And, you know, Sony embeds phase AF pixels and uses contrast detection for fine tuning. So does Nikon. You know, Panasonic, I think, is doing phase pixels. And, you know, in some of their cameras, they're using defocus, the characteristics of the blur in a defocus pattern to basically derive phase information, whether the thing's front focused, back focused. Canon is the only company, as things currently stand, I mean, obviously people are developing technology, things happen, but Canon is the only company in production with sensors that are doing 100% phase autofocus without having to throw away image pixels and replace them with something else. And they're doing it with a sensor that's more capable. Sony, Nikon, whatever, you're seeing autofocus low light performances around -4 EV. Canon's hitting -6.5 with the R6. It'll be -7 with the R3. Granted, this is with an f1.2 lens, not an f1.4 lens, so you can roll that back a half stop. So six, whatever. I mean, it's substantially faster or substantially lower light, and it's a characteristic of the lens or the sensor design, and it's something that nobody else is competing with, and it's coming kind of for free with Canon sensors. And stacking sensors or stacking chips, it's not exactly something that is impossible to develop. It's an increasingly common thing happening on the other side of the camera or the other side of the semiconductor industry in computers. Stacking memory on chips, stacking processor cores in chips. Intel has technology that they were just talking about earlier this year where they're going to be vertically stacking processors. I didn't see the whole press conference, but I vaguely remember seeing this. So instead of having essentially like a carrier substrate with chips on it, and then maybe like DRAM stacked on top of the processor module, which is something that AMD has done, GPUs have done. It's not, again, that tremendously exotic. Intel is talking about being able to stack processor modules, which the big difference in why this is important has to do with bandwidth and heat transfer and a whole bunch of other things. But it is what it is. So stacking a processor on the back of a sensor is not tremendously interesting. I mean, it's cool. It's a step forward, obviously, but it's not this completely innovative thing that Canon or Sony has just figured out and nobody else in the industry has any idea how to solder two pieces of silicon together with interconnects between the two of them. Because that's basically what it is. The same thing goes with backside illuminated sensors. They're a step forward. They can be useful. I talked about this in the video, my last video or the one before it. Backside illuminated sensors gives you the ability to have a larger percentage of the active or a larger percentage of the area under the micro lenses as active area, and it removes the traces for the conductive layers, basically the wires that connect the photodiode, from being things that sort of surround the sensor to things that are on the backside of the chip. Therefore, they're out of the way. This means that the photodiode can be closer to the surface. It means that the photodiode doesn't get shaded by the wiring, shaded essentially by the wiring, and it means that, as I said, you can have a larger active area on that photodiode or at that photodiode compared to a front side illuminated sensor. And in some respects, as far as I can tell, it's probably a fairly important part of having a stacked sensor design, because if you have all the wiring on the, if it's photodiodes, silicon wires, back of the chip, then having all that wiring back there makes it easier to connect it to another chip. You don't have to build basically vias through the sensor chip to get to an interface pad on the backside of the chip to stack it. But this stuff is not, it's not like, I mean, yes, okay, it does cost Canon money. They did have to develop this. They can't just take it out of thin air. So it's not like it was a free thing. It's not like it's something that they couldn't or they didn't have to do. But from straight up performance characteristics thing, you know, where backside illuminated sensors, you know, and ignoring the assistance, the effect assistance of having the wiring in a place that's easily accessible to stack. Where backside illuminated sensors make a lot of sense and really become significant is when you start talking about small pixels, very small pixels, like 2-micron pixels. So devices like smartphones, backside illuminated sensors are a good thing because the 12 megapixel sensor or the 20 megapixel sensor or whatever in your smartphone is really small. And the more you can do to increase the surface area of the pixel, or increase the area of the active area of the pixel, and get that pixel as close to the surface of the chip, as close to the micro lenses, as close to the available light collecting area, so you have less stuff for light to interfere with, the better. But when you start talking about big pixels, like in DSLRs, or mirrorless cameras for that matter, that utility is not as important. It still can help. It still can be a positive. But if we look at, for example, the R5, it's a 45 megapixel camera. Well, technically it's a 90 megapixel camera because of the split pixel architecture. So they actually have to have, there's actually more pixels in that camera than people really want to think about because of the dual pixel architecture. It's not backside illuminated, and it's perfectly competitive dynamic range, resolution, etc. with Sony and Nikon and Panasonic and everybody else in that 40 to 50 megapixel range. That's what the testing shows. So when you start talking about absolutely needing to have backside illuminated technology or whatever, like the question you have to think about isn't technology. There's just so many people. I don't understand what it is. I see it so often. There's so many people that want to put technology ahead of results. I keep talking about this. I have seen people say things like, I will never buy another Canon camera until they have backside illuminated sensors. And my response to that is, what do you care what the sensor is if the picture is good? I mean, what do you care how the sensor is made? What do you care? Like, it doesn't matter if what the technology is, as long as the end result is good. You know, and I talk a lot, put a lot of focus on you as a photographer are far more important for the end result, which is a picture, to be good versus the camera. But even just talking about the cameras, simple reality, couldn't care less the R5 if it's backside, front side illuminated, side illuminated, left side, right side, doesn't matter. Absolutely does not matter, because I get good pictures out of it. Would I get better pictures out of a Sony or a Nikon? Well, no. They're not, there's just not this, like, the only reason I would get better pictures out of, say, a Sony or Nikon camera is either because they had better lenses for the lenses that I use, which doesn't actually seem to be that much, you know, we're talking tenths of percentage points of better in most cases, or it has better ergonomics that let me do something easier or faster. So I can get the shot because I'm not fighting with the camera to do something, I'm just getting the shot. And the problem with that, at least for me, and this is going to be personal for everybody, is Canon's ergonomics are where I work best. I've tried Nikon. It's an absolute disaster for me. I think the way Canon, my mind works the way Canon lays out their cameras, and so they're pretty much the fastest thing on the market for me in terms of being able to just pick up a camera and get something out of it the way I want. But anyway, like I said, this idea that Canon can't make sensors, or isn't going to be able to be competitive, or Sony is going to be the only source of sensors on the market, and everybody's going to have to buy Sony sensors because nobody will be able to compete. I don't get it. I just don't understand where that thought process came from and why people would assume that all of a sudden Canon was buying Sony sensors for the R5 or R3 because it doesn't even make sense. Kind of going in line with this, there was another rumor on Canon Rumors that goes in line talking about the R3 that was rumoring that it was actually going to be a 30 megapixel camera, which is kind of what I've been saying. I think it's going to be it's going to be higher than 24 megapixels, and it's not going to be 45 megapixels, because if it was 45 megapixels, they'd be advertising 8K video capabilities. So 30 megapixels is about what I expected the camera to be. So Canon's talking about 30 frames a second. Well, 30 frames a second at 30 megapixels isn't exactly isn't exactly that big of a leap. The R5 shoots 8K video, which is 32 to 35 megapixels at 30 frames a second. But apparently some part of the internet seems to believe that for Canon to produce a 30 megapixel camera that shoots at 30 frames a second, they'd have to buy Sony sensors because they can't do it. Except the R5 already kind of does that. Now, okay, you could pick nits about the fact that the R5 is, 12-bit in RAW at 8K and not 14-bit, but that's also a problem that the stacked sensor architecture solves because once you put the processor or put processing right on the back of the sensor, you have tremendously more bandwidth between the sensor and the processor. That improves your rolling shutter readout. And this goes back to one of those things that I think I talked about it last week, but rolling shutter, everybody complains about rolling shutter. Everybody wants global shutters. Mechanical shutters are rolling shutters. They just roll really quickly. And so consequently, nobody complains about mechanical shutters being rolling shutters because they're fast enough. So do you really, like, as much as I think it would be awesome to have a global shutter camera, the idea, like, I really like the idea of a mirrorless camera that has the only thing that the mechanical shutter in the camera therefore is to protect the sensor when you remove the lens, and therefore can be built at to be very slow. It doesn't have to be precision. It doesn't have to be timed well. It just has to be able to close, be open, and be reliable. And everything else you shoot gets handled with an electronic shutter. And if it's a global electronic shutter, you actually have better shutter behavior than you would have even with a purely mechanical shuttered camera, like even a DSLR. Just like I said, you have one curtain opens, then another curtain closes. That's a rolling shutter. So if Canon can get the rolling shutter readout on the R3 fast enough that you can't tell the difference between the rolling shutter, the electronic rolling shutter, and a mechanical shutter, who cares? Like, again, global shutter sounds great, but if you can read a rolling shutter out so fast that it acts like like a mechanical shutter, functionally, it's moot. The argument, as far as I'm concerned, is moot, because the end result is essentially, it's the same thing. You can't tell, if you can't visually tell the difference in the pictures taken, then as far as I'm concerned, as far as the key performance indicator, the picture. If you can't tell the pictures apart, the technology underlying that makes them is immaterial. And if making a really fast rolling shutter that's as fast or faster than a mechanical shutter is cheaper and more effective than a global shutter and gives you better dynamic range than a global shutter, then it's kind of better technology as far as I'm concerned. So anyway, that was half of what I wanted to talk about, and that actually ran kind of longer than I was expecting. The other thing I wanted to talk about was some rumored RF lenses. Now, of course, the problem with rumored lenses is most lens rumors come from patents. And patents on lenses tend to be something, if you've ever stopped, sat back, and looked, lots of stuff gets patented. Not all of that actually makes it to market. And so it's very easy to look at patents and say, oh, well, there's going to be all these awesome things coming, and not have those things come to market. And in many cases, patents will often have multiple focal lengths, they'll have multiple apertures, it'll be multiple things going on that are covered in one patent. But anyway, the short of it is patents have been dug up for a 24, a 28, and a 35 f1.2 lens. They're being described as L's, which is probably the case. And so the question that I ask is this a good idea? So we got a 50 f1.2, we got an 85 f1.2. Is it a good thing? You know, is this a good direction, whatever, for having all of the Canon RF primes, L primes being f1.2? And I got to admit, I'm kind of mixed field with this. So there's part of me that really likes the idea of L primes f1.2 unless f1.2 aperture makes it too big to be f1.2. So 85 is probably the limit of what you're going to be able to do as an f1.2 lens before it just gets too unwieldy. Therefore, like a 105 would probably be f2 or maybe f1.4, but probably f2. A 200 might be f2, but probably 2.8. But you know, Canon has done a 200 f2 and it was a big lens. I'm not sure that mirrorless is really going to be something that makes that much smaller. So again, I can see Canon doing a 200 f2, but I think they're also going to have a 200 2.8 as well. Then you'd have the super fast zoom. So the 28 to 70 f2. I'm kind of really interested to see if Canon does a 70 to 105 or 70 to 135 or something like that f2, because that would kind of be a nice set of lenses for portraiture and that kind of thing. Then you have the sort of the meat and potatoes, the f2.8 zooms, and then you have the f4 zooms. And I'm kind of ignoring the consumer level lenses, the variable aperture stuff, because, well, I don't use it, so I'm not really paying that much attention to it. So that could be interesting. The problem I have is generally I'm not a prime shooter. I like my zooms. One of the advantages of primes tends to be that they're light and small. And that's true to an extent, but an f1.2 lens has a hard time being light and small. And yes, Canon has a 50 f1.8 for the RF platform, but it's also basically an entry-level lens. And so right now, for example, in the 50mm market, and this was even kind of to an extent true in 35 millimeter land, or in DSLR land, you had an entry level 50 millimeter f1.8, and then you had a super expensive 50 millimeter f1.2, and that was sort of it. Now, I know in DSLR land, they had a 50 f1.4 that wasn't all that much better than the 50 f1.8. It was, I think, worse optically than the 50 f1.8 STM. It had some issues with the autofocus performance. It wasn't something that Canon spent a lot of time updating, revising, improving, or doing anything with. And then the other small primes in Canon's DSLR land were entry level. They mostly STM lenses. Some of them were image stabilized. They aren't weather sealed, which to me is a selling point, because I end up out in the rain a lot, honestly. They weren't. I looked at them and I never really found them to be tremendously attractive lenses. So it's, I mean, I know they're attractive to some people and people are going to buy them, but I never felt that way for me. So going all f1.2 on the primes for the RF platform, I mean, it certainly would put the primes a half stop faster than the competition. Sony doesn't have anything, as far as I remember, when I last time I looked through their site, faster than f1.4. Nikon obviously has the boat anchor 58 f9.95, but that's a manual focus lens, so that's like, and it's $8,000, $6,000 or $8,000. It's a really expensive lens, which puts it off in such a niche place. I mean, I've talked about this in the past, that in terms of showcasing how awesome your platform is and attracting photographers, I don't really see the Nikon Noct being all that in a bag of chips. It's an incredible lens, and if you're the right person who that's the right song for you, it's an incredible lens for you, and maybe the complete and only compelling reason that for that, you know, for that person to go Nikon. But for the platform as a whole, you know, that's going to sell, like, that's not going to be a big seller, and it's not a standard sort of part of the what people are going to have as a staple lens. So I think it's interesting, you know, if they can keep them relatively light, the f1.2 probably won't be a bad thing. And do something to keep the costs relatively in check. Before I go to the last thing I want to talk about, I want to jump back real quick. So this is what I was saying about the problem that I've been having with the EOS utility. I had 3 dropouts in the first 4 or 5 minutes of this video. And for the last 34-ish, 35 minutes, it has been rock steady. I haven't had any problems or camera dropouts or video dropouts whatsoever. And this leads me to think it's not the camera and it's not a problem with the firmware. It's something else going on. Maybe it's something with OBS. Maybe it's something with the EOS Webcam utility. But generally, it seems to me like if I let the camera sit and warm up and get going for 5 or 6 minutes or 10 minutes, it stays pretty stable for the entire time that I'm using it, maybe dropping out once around 45 or 50 minutes. If I don't, it flakes out at the start, but then on other days it doesn't at all. So anyway, the last thing I wanted to talk about, there was a rumor posted on Nautica, I don't know exactly how you pronounce it. It was a tweet posted by them that I happened to see in a discussion on Canon Rumors of a 14 to 35 f4 IS. And this kind of was something I was thinking thinking about too. Now, I haven't seen anything anywhere else about this. In DSLR land, the f4 versions of, like, so part of it is I'm not even quite sure where this fits. So if you go in to look at lenses and DSLR lands, there's the 11-24, and there's the 16-35 f4, which basically replaced the 17-40 f4. So the 17-40 being longer could be smaller, so that kind of, I guess, made sense. The 16-35 f4 was image stabilized, and that kind of makes sense. A 14-35 f4 doesn't really slot in where the 11-24 did, because 14 is not 11. And yeah, the only one of the 11-24 only went to 24, or was it 10-24? It's been so long since I looked at it, I don't even remember now. But the 10 or 11-24, it only went to 24, but the wide end was so much wider. Boy, I'm going to just look that up real quick, because that's going to bother me if I'm sitting here talking about lenses and I'm not even sure what the exact lens was. So it was a 11-24 f4, so I was right. The 14-35 in some ways would end up undercutting the 15-35 because it's wider. Is that a problem? Does that make sense? I don't know. I looked real quick. Sony has, I think it's a 12-24 f4, and they have a, which is relatively compact. So it could be compact, and that could work. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I do know that if that is something that Canon does run with, it probably is going to throw a monkey wrench in my plans. Because my plans personally was to go with the 15-35 2.8 IS. And the reason for that is that would make a pretty good lens, that it's fast enough that it would make a better lens, because I've done night stuff with my 16-35 f4, and night landscapes are kind of meh. The f4 is, I'd rather have an f2.8 lens than an f4 lens. It works, but a lot of times I end up using my 24-70 2.8 because I get that stop faster aperture. So a 14-35 f4 versus a 15-35 f2.8. That's an interesting question. That would be an interesting lens, and I'm interested to see what other people think about that, because I love ultra wide angle lenses. It's probably my favorite focal length in terms of things to shoot, or things to shoot with. It's also the focal length that I have the hardest time using. It's just between hard to use for just finding situations where it's really effective to use it, and having the right subject matter. Like, it just, I like shooting with it, but it's hard. It's, so going wider versus faster, for me, I feel like faster makes more sense because the application in night landscapes. But then, hey, 24 1.2, that would be fun. Anyway, like I said, the primary purpose of this video was, or this live stream, was to test out the firmware for the 5D Mark IV 1.3.3, because it was stated to be improved USB 3 performance or cable compatibility or something to that effect. And it didn't seem to make a difference to the problems that I've been perpetually having with the Canon EOS Webcam utility. So it's a wash, I guess, maybe. I don't know. the stream's definitely been stable since like 5 minutes in, but wasn't so great getting started. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing. I try not to do these live streams unless I have something worth talking about or something that I absolutely can't really reasonably, in this case, for example, test without doing something like where I'm actually looking at the camera instead of just sort of sitting here and thinking, well, maybe it'll work. But anyway, if you found this interesting, please consider smashing the like button. Please consider subscribing. Like I said, I don't do these live streams unless I have something to talk about, which isn't every week. So, you know, if you're subscribed, you will be notified. Well, and tick the bell, I guess, if you really feel like it, so you be notified when I do one of these live streams. As always, again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.